Tonight, we follow the trail of money through the one place no one dared to audit. A vault behind Vatican walls, where the ledgers don't just track donations, they chart influence, alliances, and betrayal. A place where numbers vanish, not through error, but through design. Where sacred accounts turn silent, and questions echo with no one left to answer. For decades, the Vatican Bank stood as the financial ghost of the Holy See. No windows, no public records, no balance sheets that could be trusted. Just a name few outsiders understood: Istituto per le Opere di Religione, the Institute for the Works of Religion. But behind that name, behind the solemn Latin, moved something much darker than charity. They say it was a bank for the faithful, that it served missionaries, churches, and the poor. But what do you call a charity that buys luxury apartments in London with money meant for the hungry? What do you call a sanctuary that launders billions through shell companies and offshore accounts? The story of the Vatican Bank is not about gold crosses or holy water. It's about numbered accounts with no owners, priests who spoke the language of bankers, and real estate deals signed in God's name but sealed in silence. It begins after the war, when Europe lay in ruins and the church became a safe harbour for more than just refugees. Reconstruction funds flowed in, but so did the money of exiles, dictators, and secret alliances. The bank grew, not in faith, but in reach. Its walls couldn't be breached, not by investigators, not by journalists, not even by truth. Those who looked too closely paid in more than reputation. A banker found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge, a whistleblower whose hotel room turned crime scene, a trail of paper that always ended one step short of the altar. And when the questions got too loud, new boards were formed, new policies announced, but the circuits underneath stayed the same. Even today, we are told reforms are working, that transparency is here, but ask anyone who has followed the money and they'll tell you the same thing. The Vatican Bank doesn't answer questions, it buries them. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because tonight, we open the books they swore had no pages. We speak of priests with portfolios, cardinals who signed off on secrecy, and ledgers written in shadows. This isn't just a scandal. It's a confession wrapped in silk, sealed with a cross, and delivered by couriers who were never meant to be seen. And the deeper you go, the more you realize this isn't just about faith, it's about power, silent, absolute, and tax-free. Tonight, we begin not with what the Church teaches, but with what it tries hardest to forget. Welcome to the story of the Vatican Bank. Not what it is, but what it became. They say the Vatican holds many secrets, but few know that beneath its marble floors lies a vault that isn't filled with relics or ancient bones, but with something far more powerful: money. Not ordinary money, not savings or coins in jars, but a network of hidden accounts, unseen transactions, and names that never appear in any public record. In the heart of the smallest country on earth sits one of the most secretive banks in history, and the only thing more mysterious than what it protects is who it serves. They call it the Vatican Bank, but its real name sounds almost poetic: the Institute for the Works of Religion. It sounds holy, righteous, like a treasury for good deeds. But inside that name hides something else: a financial machine that has quietly shaped politics, funded revolutions, and kept the church standing through every scandal it ever faced. No one really knows when the first secret key was forged, but by the mid-20th century, the Vatican Bank had already become more than a bank. It was a bridge between faith and power, a place where prayers met profits, and where the line between miracle and manipulation became almost impossible to see. It was supposed to fund missions, hospitals, and schools, but some say it became a vault for secrets, a sanctuary for money that could not exist anywhere else. A priest could bless your wedding, hear your sins, and by night approve million-dollar transfers with just one signature. It wasn't greed, they said. it was necessity. Because when empires fell and wars ended, the church remained, and to remain, it needed a different kind of power, the kind that never had to confess. Imagine a vault with no windows, a building that appears ordinary from the outside, but sits on centuries of quiet transactions. Imagine corridors so silent you could hear your own heartbeat echo off the stone. Inside are files stamped with symbols, not names. Accounts linked to charities that never existed, and deposits that appear only as whispers in ledgers that no one but a few chosen men have ever seen. The Vatican Bank isn't large. It could fit inside a small cathedral, but its influence stretches across continents. It has no ATMs, no public branches, and yet it moves billions. It operates outside the rules of any country, shielded by sovereignty, protected by faith. And the strangest part, no one outside its walls can truly say where the money begins or where it ends. Over the years, journalists, investigators, even popes have tried to pull back the curtain. Some found fragments, some found danger, and a few simply disappeared from the story altogether. Because behind the golden crosses and marble altars, there's another church, one built not on belief, but on control. Tonight, we unlock the first door to that world. A world where salvation comes in numbers, where trust is currency, and where one missing key can open not just a vault, but an entire history of holy scandal. From the outside, it looks like any other office inside the Vatican walls. Quiet, unmarked, uninviting. No sign says bank, no glass doors, no counters, no customers. But inside those rooms, a silent network hums with activity that connects the Holy See to the farthest corners of the world. It's called the Institute for the Works of Religion, but almost everyone knows it by another name, the Vatican Bank. The name itself is misleading, because technically it isn't a bank at all. There are no credit cards, no loans, no checking accounts. It doesn't answer to international regulators or normal banking laws. It answers only to the Pope. That makes it the most unique financial institution on earth, a sovereign vault within a sovereign city, a system built entirely on faith and trust, at least on the surface. The Vatican Bank was created in 1942, during one of the darkest moments in modern history, when war divided the world and governments were collapsing. The Church said it needed a way to protect its charities, to move money safely across borders, to keep missions alive when the world was burning. It sounded noble, but in the fog of war, noble intentions often become convenient excuses. Over the decades, this quiet institution turned into something far larger than anyone imagined. It became a place where faith met finance, and secrecy became tradition. Every account was protected not just by law, but by divine privilege. Because inside the Vatican walls, the rules of other nations simply don't apply. Imagine a bank that doesn't pay taxes, that can't be audited without permission, and that operates entirely behind closed doors. For many, that sounds like paradise. For others, it sounds like a perfect hiding place. The Vatican called it necessary. Critics called it untouchable. In the years that followed, governments tried to peek inside, journalists asked questions, and even insiders began to whisper. They said that not all the money came from offerings and donations. Some came from businessmen, politicians, even secret services, who needed a clean channel to move funds without a trace. The Vatican denied it all, but the evidence kept growing. A transfer here, a hidden account there, a name that suddenly disappeared from the record. It was as if the entire system was designed to exist between light and shadow, holy intentions wrapped in financial smoke. The Institute claimed it was only for church work, but who decides what counts as the work of God? A hospital in Africa? Yes. A covert political payment, maybe. The lines blurred. Every time a scandal broke, the church promised reform, new directors, new oversight. But the structure itself never changed. Because deep down, the Vatican Bank wasn't meant to serve the world. It was meant to protect the church from the world. It was a fortress built not from stone, but from privilege, a vault no one could breach. And within those walls, faith and secrecy became one and the same. Europe in the years after the Second World War was a continent of ghosts. Cities lay in ruins, millions were displaced, and hunger replaced hope. Nations were rebuilding from ashes, and money flowed like water through the cracks from governments, charities, and secret operations. In that chaos, the Vatican found itself in a strange position. It was untouched by bombs, untouched by occupation, and yet it sat in the center of a broken world. Surrounded by suffering, the Church became a channel for aid. Donations poured in from the faithful, from wealthy families, and even from political powers hoping to rebuild Europe in their own image. But where there is chaos, there is opportunity. The Vatican Bank, newly formed in 1942, became the perfect vessel to move that money. Officially, it was for the needy, the hungry, the lost. Unofficially, it became a network where noble causes and secret agendas began to share the same ledger. No one outside could track it. The Vatican was sovereign, immune to inspection, invisible to the rules that governed other banks. To the world, it looked like charity. Inside, it was becoming something else. The lines between mercy and manipulation began to blur. Priests who once carried blessings now carried envelopes. Humanitarian aid sometimes arrived in strange places, helping not just the poor but the powerful. As Europe divided between East and West, between democracy and communism, the Vatican quietly chose sides. Funds began to flow not only to churches and orphanages, but to political groups that could fight the spread of ideas the Church feared. It was the birth of the shadow ledger, a book within the book, where certain transactions existed only in whispers. To understand the Vatican Bank of that time, you have to understand how secrecy became a virtue. Every account was cloaked in holiness. Every transaction was a sacred act, protected by confession-like silence. The Church had diplomatic immunity, its couriers untouchable, its vaults unsearchable. It could receive gold from South America one day, send aid to Eastern Europe the next, and no one outside the walls could ever see the trail. Some say this hidden system saved lives. Others say it created a new kind of power, one that could not be voted out or brought to trial. The same secrecy that once protected persecuted priests now protected profit. And as Europe healed, the Vatican's balance sheets began to glow with quiet strength. No one dared question it. To question the Church's money was to question its mission. But behind the prayers and papers, the ledgers told a different story. Funds meant for refugees sometimes vanished. Charities no one could locate kept receiving donations. A small circle of priests and financiers controlled it all, guided by a single belief that the ends justified the means. In the ruins of post-war Europe, while nations rebuilt with sweat and steel, the Vatican built something far more invisible, a web of influence hidden inside a bank account, a power written not in scripture, but in numbers. Inside the walls of the Vatican, secrecy wasn't just a policy, it was a virtue. Every conversation echoed behind closed doors, every document sealed with wax, and every account guarded by names that no longer existed. In the early years of the Vatican Bank, something new began to take shape. Numbered accounts. No names, no faces, just codes. The system was perfect for priests who needed privacy, missionaries working in dangerous regions, or donors who preferred to keep their generosity quiet. But soon, it became something much more. Anonymity turned from protection into power. These numbered accounts worked like invisible vaults, each one linked to a story that only a few would ever know. A letter would arrive, written by hand, sealed and delivered by a trusted courier. Inside, instructions, sometimes a deposit, sometimes a transfer, sometimes nothing, but a code that only the receiver understood. The Vatican's special status meant no one could question it. No foreign government, no bank inspector, not even Italian authorities had the right to demand an answer. The Vatican was a state within a state, and its bank was the safest secret in Europe. Some of the accounts belonged to bishops managing missions in Africa or Asia, but others, people whispered, were connected to politicians, businessmen, even intelligence services. Money flowed in from nations on both sides of the Cold War, disguised as charity, funneled through faith. Each numbered account was a door to a hidden story, one that began in piety and ended in politics. The Church called it prudence. Critics called it concealment. For the men who managed the ledgers, it was both. They believed secrecy protected the Church's independence, that too much light could invite danger. But secrecy has a way of feeding itself. What started as discretion became a habit, and soon the Vatican Bank was running on shadows. Whispers began to spread through Rome about mysterious briefcases carried in and out of the Apostolic Palace, about transactions that no one could trace. When journalists asked questions, they found only silence, polite smiles, and the same answer repeated again and again. The Church doesn't discuss its finances, but money, no matter how divine its purpose, leaves traces. And as the years passed, too many of those traces led back to the same place. Numbered accounts that never closed, signatures that never matched, donations that arrived from nowhere and disappeared just as quietly. To the outside world, the Vatican remained pure, untouchable. Inside, its bank was learning a dangerous lesson, that faith could hide a fortune. It was the beginning of a long pattern, a world where sacred trust became a shield, where the same hands that blessed also counted bills, and where every number in the ledger carried a secret no one dared to write down. He wore a cassock like armour, and a smile that could open doors in any capital city. To the faithful, he was a priest. To those who understood the shadows, he was something else, the architect of the Vatican's financial empire. His name changed depending on who told the story. Sometimes he was a Monsignor, sometimes a cardinal's secretary, sometimes just the man in black who could make problems disappear. He spoke softly, but his phone book was thicker than the catechism itself. Bankers, ministers, princes, spies, all answered when he called. He understood the language of both worlds, the sacred and the financial, and he used it to build bridges that no one else dared to cross. Inside the Vatican Bank, he became legend. He didn't count money, he moved it. From Switzerland to South America, from Rome to London, millions passed through his hands without ever touching daylight. He said it was for the good of the Church, to fund missions, to help the poor, to protect the faithful. But not everyone believed him. Some said he was too close to certain businessmen, men who wore suits instead of robes, men who smiled too easily when he entered the room. Others said he was the only one who truly understood how the Vatican Bank worked, that without him the whole structure would crumble. He held meetings in secret apartments and made deals in quiet restaurants where the sound of the city faded behind thick velvet curtains. Sometimes he would travel under false names, his suitcase filled not with clothes, but with documents and promises. To the outside world, he was invisible. To those inside, he was indispensable. He knew which accounts were clean and which ones were not. He knew which bishops moved real money and which ones just pretended. And above all, he knew the one truth everyone else feared, that the Church was no longer just a spiritual empire, it was a financial one. The Monsignor saw himself as a builder, not of cathedrals but of systems. He once said that stone crumbles, but numbers last forever. His office was filled with papers, letters from donors, reports from offshore banks, and a small crucifix that sat beside his telephone. He would pray before major transfers, as if asking for forgiveness in advance. And when the Vatican faced accusations, he would appear calm, almost serene, and remind everyone that even saints needed structure. But power built in silence has a way of turning on its creator. As his influence grew, so did his enemies. Some envied him, others feared him, a few began to plot against him. Rumors spread that he had files on everyone, that he kept copies of everything he touched, that he knew too much to ever be dismissed. In the end, no one could tell where his faith ended and his ambition began. The Vatican Bank was his cathedral, and he was its architect, a man who believed that money, in the right hands, could serve God, but in the wrong ones, could almost replace him. He was not a priest, but when he walked through the marble halls of the Vatican, even cardinals nodded. They called him the Banker of God, a title he wore like a crown. He was charming, persuasive, the kind of man who could turn a casual meeting into a fortune. He didn't preach from a pulpit, he preached from a balance sheet. Around him swirled a new kind of power inside the Vatican Bank, one that depended less on prayer and more on persuasion. The church needed men like him, or so they said. Men who could speak the language of markets, who could turn donations into investments, who could make the church's wealth grow quietly behind the scenes. In post-war Europe, money had become as sacred as faith, and the Banker of God knew how to worship both. He met clients not in chapels, but in Roman cafes, under the golden glow of street lamps and the quiet hum of espresso machines. He made promises between sips of wine, deals between whispers. When he travelled to Switzerland, he stayed in chalets where the air was thin and the company even thinner. In London, he mingled with financiers and nobles, men who smiled when he mentioned the Vatican, because they understood that behind the robes and rituals was a vault unlike any other. To them, the church was not just a symbol of salvation, it was an opportunity. For every deal that helped the poor, there was another that helped the powerful. For every foundation built in the name of faith, there was a shell company hidden in the name of convenience. The Banker of God moved between these worlds effortlessly. He spoke of charity in the morning and profit by night. He claimed his work kept the church independent, free from the grip of secular powers, but his independence came at a price. The line between helping the church and using it began to fade. His network of contacts grew wider, politicians, businessmen, secret agents, all drawn to the same magnetic center, the Vatican's untouchable wealth. Some believed he was a genius, others thought he was a danger. Within the Vatican walls, whispers followed him like incense. Some said he kept two ledgers, one for God and one for himself. Others said he knew too much, that the Pope himself needed him but could never trust him. And outside those walls, the Banker of God became both admired and feared. Newspapers wrote about his luxury homes and mysterious trips. Governments began to take interest. But no one could ever prove anything. Every paper trail vanished behind a curtain of holy immunity. He was the perfect middleman between heaven and earth, between faith and finance, between good intentions and greed. And in a world where the church needed money as much as miracles, he became indispensable. Yet every empire built on secrets eventually faces the light, and for the Banker of God, that light was getting closer with every deal signed, every favour granted, every shadow he thought would never follow him home. In the 1970s, the world of finance was changing faster than anyone could keep up, and the Vatican found itself at the centre of a web that stretched across continents. The Banco Ambrosiano, one of Italy's largest banks, became a cathedral not of stone but of paper. Ledgers stacked like towers, promises written in ink that glimmered like stained glass, and offshore accounts hidden in places almost no one could pronounce. Money flowed in rivers, sometimes through Switzerland, sometimes through the Caribbean, often through both at the same time. Shell companies acted as invisible scaffolding, supporting an edifice that seemed unshakable. At first, it appeared miraculous. Funds that were meant for investment in social projects multiplied, new branches opened, and the church's influence seemed untouchable. But behind the gleaming surface, the construction was fragile. Every transaction relied on trust, every loan on faith, and faith alone could not hold forever. When investors looked at the ledgers, they saw numbers. What they could not see were the silent agreements, the hidden transfers, the reciprocal loans that balanced one another in ways that made the bank appear richer than it truly was. People whispered that the Vatican Bank had become the heart of the operation, a quiet engine pumping liquidity into a system designed to impress, but not always to sustain. And then came the tremors. Late nights spent counting sheets, early mornings filled with phone calls to offices no one knew existed, and suddenly the scaffolding that had seemed permanent began to wobble. Depositors demanded explanations. Auditors asked questions. Journalists smelled a story and followed the faintest scent of paper trails. But inside the bank, men in suits and priests in cassocks moved like shadows, shuffling accounts, moving assets from one shell company to another, trying to keep the cathedral upright. The truth was, the Ambrosiano Empire was built on promises, and promises are fragile. A single misstep, a single withdrawal, could topple towers that took decades to rise. And when the wind shifted in the mid-1980s, it did just that. Reports of missing millions, of irregular transfers, began to surface. The Vatican claimed ignorance. Managers pointed fingers. Some disappeared from the story entirely, leaving only whispers in the corridors of Rome. What had seemed untouchable became vulnerable overnight. The lesson was clear. Paper may soar like spires in a cathedral, but when it rests on secrets and silence, it trembles at the first gust. And for those who had built it, those who had moved the money with such care and devotion, the collapse was not just financial, it was moral. A cathedral of paper can stand as long as belief holds, but when faith falters, the walls come down, and every hidden corner is exposed to light. The Ambrosiano affair would become a legend, a warning that even institutions cloaked in holiness are not immune to the consequences of ambition, secrecy, and the fragile nature of promises written only in ink. The river flowed cold and dark beneath the Blackfriars Bridge in London, carrying centuries of stories and secrets. One morning in 1982, a body was discovered, pale and still, its pockets heavy with stones that dragged it beneath the surface. Clutched in one hand was a small note, folded and waterlogged, the ink smudged almost beyond recognition. It asked a question, the question everyone wanted answered, and yet, when the corpse was pulled from the water, the note provided nothing. No name, no explanation, only a reminder that some truths are meant to vanish. The man had been connected to the Vatican Bank, a mid-level financier whose job had taken him from Rome to London, carrying envelopes, whispers, and promises. People said he knew too much, that he had seen ledgers others were not meant to see, accounts that moved like ghosts across continents. His death was a warning, but to whom? No one could say. The police investigated, as they always did, but in this case, even their questions were muted. The trail led to empty offices, to phone lines that rang without answer, to hotel rooms cleaned before anyone could enter. Rumours began to swirl in the coffee shops and bars near the Thames. Some whispered that the Vatican itself had orchestrated the disappearance. Others said it was a rogue network, an alliance of financiers who feared exposure. Everyone agreed on one thing. The man had been caught between worlds. He had walked a bridge not only of stone, but of influence, connecting London to Rome, finance to faith, secrecy to power, and on that bridge he had fallen, or been pushed. The note in his hand, soaked and illegible, was a final puzzle. It was supposed to reveal the truth, or perhaps hide it further. Whatever it had said, it was now lost to the currents, a metaphor for the many secrets flowing quietly beneath the surface of the church's finances. The Blackfriars Bridge became more than a crossing over the Thames. It became a symbol, a place where ambition and fear collided, and where those who moved money in the shadows discovered that even loyalty cannot guarantee safety. Investigators noted the precise arrangement of the stones in his pockets, the careful folding of the paper, the lack of any other marks on his body. Nothing about the scene was random, yet nothing could point conclusively to a culprit. It was as if the crime itself had been designed to confuse, to keep questions alive while answers were swallowed by the river. In the days that followed, whispers turned into rumours, rumours into theories. Some said the body was proof that the Vatican Bank held power beyond borders, beyond law, beyond morality. Others believed it was a warning from the underworld of finance, a reminder that knowledge is dangerous when it sits at the intersection of faith and money. No one ever discovered who truly pulled the strings. The corpse, the stones, and the note remained, like a dark parable in a city full of secrets, a single event that hinted at the labyrinthine world behind the Vatican's golden doors, a world where the cost of knowing too much could be fatal. In quiet rooms behind unmarked doors, men and women gathered under the guise of friendship, fraternity, and ritual. They called themselves a lodge, a name that sounded harmless enough, but inside, masks hid intentions and handshakes concealed allegiances. Secret societies have existed for centuries, and in the world of the Vatican Bank, they became more than curiosity. They became instruments of influence. The lodge was a place where bankers met with politicians, journalists sipped coffee next to financiers, and deals that shaped nations were whispered into being. Membership was by invitation only, and the initiation was silent, a test of loyalty, discretion, and understanding. They learned quickly that in these circles, truth was optional. Stories were bent, facts obscured, and allegiances shifted like shadows on candlelit walls. The Vatican's financial operatives moved through this web as though it were a map, each handshake a key, each coded phrase a pass into hidden corridors of power. The lodge itself had no official address. Meetings were held in old mansions in Rome, private suites in London, and discreet chalets in Switzerland. The locations changed, but the purpose remained constant. Those inside believed they were guardians of order, keepers of a balance that could maintain the Church's independence while influencing the outside world. But for outsiders, the lodge was a labyrinth, impossible to penetrate, full of people whose motives were hidden behind masks, both literal and figurative. The codes they used were subtle, gestures that seemed innocent to the untrained eye. A tap on a shoulder, a slight bow, a word whispered in Latin. Each signal indicated a connection, a trust, a shared knowledge that could open doors or close them forever. Newspapers tried to follow the trail. Investigators attempted to uncover the networks. Each time, they were met with silence, polite denials, and the subtle pressure of power that stretched far beyond the room in which the lodge met. Some said the lodge influenced policy, swayed decisions in parliaments, and guided the stories that appeared in newspapers. Others claimed it moved money across borders in ways no ordinary bank could understand, its reach extending into boardrooms of companies the public never knew existed. For decades, the lodge operated quietly, unseen, but its effects were everywhere. Deals made in shadow often became law, investments redirected by unseen hands, fortunes shifted without explanation. Inside, members believed in the sanctity of secrecy, that only by hiding the truth could they maintain order. Outside, the world felt the consequences without ever knowing the cause. And in the centre of it all, the Vatican Bank remained a hub, a quiet engine fueling the lodge's influence. Money, masks, and loyalty combined into a system that no outsider could fully grasp, a network where truth was negotiable and silence was a currency more valuable than gold. The lodge was not evil, and it was not benevolent. It simply existed, a reflection of what happens when power meets secrecy, and when ambition wears a mask that never comes off. In the 1980s, the Vatican Bank entered what many would later call a golden era, a time when its influence stretched across continents, and its connections seemed untouchable. Priests and financiers worked side by side, moving money, negotiating deals, and cultivating relationships that were meant to protect the Church and its wealth. At first, it looked like a miracle of diplomacy, a network built on faith and trust. But miracles can sour, and trust can curdle. The same hands that blessed also held the power to condemn. Relationships that once opened doors began to close them, often violently. Accounts that were thought secure were exposed. Lawsuits emerged in Rome, Milan, London, and New York. Prosecutors scrutinized transactions that had been invisible for decades. Some priests found themselves under investigation, their reputations tested, their sacred authority questioned. Those who once guided millions suddenly faced the sharp edge of the law. And then came the mysterious illnesses. One by one, men connected to the bank fell ill under strange circumstances. Some died in hospital beds with no cause ever explained. Others recovered but were never the same. Rumors swirled that these illnesses were no accidents, that they were warnings meant to silence, to caution, to protect secrets too dangerous to be spoken. Investigators and journalists tried to follow the threads, but the pattern was slippery, hidden behind diplomatic immunity, secrecy agreements, and the quiet insistence that the church's business was not to be questioned. Penitents read prayers, prosecutors read statutes. Two very different scriptures, each claiming authority, each trying to interpret the same world. As the scandals mounted, it became clear that what had been a golden era was also a poisoned one. Those who once benefited from the church's networks now realized that proximity to power carried risks no confessional could absolve. In Rome, whispers circulated through marble corridors, echoing off stone walls, carrying stories of bribery, fraud, and betrayal. Some said entire accounts had vanished overnight. Others claimed meetings had been held in secret to redirect funds just before authorities could intervene. The golden chalice, once a symbol of faith, had become a vessel for something far darker. And yet, outside the Vatican, the public remained largely unaware. Headlines hinted at trouble, but the full extent of the corruption was obscured by layers of secrecy, legal maneuvering, and diplomatic pressure. For those inside, the lesson was clear. Even holiness cannot shield one from human ambition. Even faith cannot protect against the consequences of power misused. The priest and the poisoned chalice became more than a metaphor. It was a reality lived daily by those who navigated the Vatican Bank, a reminder that wealth, secrecy, and influence are intoxicating, but that the same hands that lift the chalice can also deliver a sting that no prayer can soften. And in that quiet, shadowed world, the line between sacred duty and personal risk blurred until it was nearly invisible, leaving only questions that may never be answered. In the labyrinth of Rome, buildings stood with marble facades, their plaques announcing missions of mercy, compassion, and service. Charities bloomed with beautiful names, each one promising hope, relief, and a better world. But inside, offices were often empty, corridors silent, and phone lines that rang endlessly without answer. These organizations became more than instruments of aid. They became conduits for wealth, channels through which the Vatican Bank could move millions without leaving visible traces. Donations flowed in from around the world, from wealthy families who believed in doing good, from governments seeking favor, and from corporations hoping to align themselves with sanctity. Once inside, the money rarely stayed where it was intended. Ledgers recorded generosity, but the paths of the funds often twisted into offshore accounts, shell companies, and investments that bore little resemblance to charity. Foundations existed on paper, their names invoking hope, their offices sometimes nothing more than letterboxes. Employees, when they existed, were often unaware of the full scope of operations, simply following instructions from faceless superiors who spoke of God, stewardship, and responsibility. The language of mercy became a password, a code to unlock transactions invisible to the outside world. Clerics in cassocks signed letters, approved transfers, and verified donations, all while knowing that the true journey of the money was hidden. Some funds ended up in legitimate projects, hospitals, orphanages, and schools. Others flowed into accounts that were never audited, accounts that supported political operations, investments in companies that promised profit more than purpose, and projects whose names appeared only in private ledgers. The duality of purpose created a world where piety and profit intertwined, where helping the poor could also build influence in the shadows. For decades, the system functioned with quiet efficiency, protected by the sanctity of faith, the weight of history, and the immunity granted by sovereign status. Critics, who looked too closely, were met with polite denials, veiled threats, or, in some cases, obstacles that prevented scrutiny entirely. Journalists writing about charities found stories that seemed compelling but impossible to verify. Government auditors were often blocked by treaties, by claims of ecclesiastical independence, or by the quiet pressure of diplomatic channels. And so the money moved, like a river beneath the streets of Rome, visible only to those who already knew where to look. Holy hands touched the ledgers, dirty hands moved the funds, and the world outside assumed that mercy reigned. But inside, every transfer, every foundation, and every donation carried a story that few would ever hear. It was a network of influence disguised as generosity, an empire built on faith, secrecy, and the careful illusion that piety and profit could coexist without conflict. The truth, when it emerged, revealed a world where holiness was a cover, charity a tool, and the hands that moved money were both blessed and stained. And in that delicate balance, the Vatican Bank maintained its power, teaching a quiet lesson about the cost of moving wealth where no one is watching. The world outside Rome believed banks were places of rules, ledgers, and transparency, but the Vatican Bank played a different game. Across Europe and beyond, islands of secrecy awaited, scattered like beads on a rosary. Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, Panama, names whispered in the corridors of power, places where law and faith could intersect without anyone watching. These were not exotic vacation spots, but sanctuaries for money that wanted to be invisible. Shell companies nested within other shells, each layer hiding the hand that controlled it. Accounts existed without names, directors without identities, and addresses that led nowhere. If you could not see the owner, you could not see the sin, and in this world, anonymity was both shield and weapon. Money moved silently, slipping from Rome to Zurich, then to Nassau, back through Geneva, and finally resting in a ledger that might never be audited. Auditors could ask questions, but often received carefully worded replies that revealed nothing. Investigators reached dead ends, files disappeared, and sometimes those who pressed too hard found their careers quietly redirected. The island of lost receipts was not a single location but a network, a shadow economy built on faith, secrecy, and legal loopholes. Clerics signed documents that seemed official but often led to accounts far beyond scrutiny. Lawyers certified structures that existed on paper alone. Bankers in city centres spoke in codes, their language precise, mathematical, and impenetrable. Occasionally, a receipt appeared, a piece of paper that told a story of a transfer, a loan, or an investment. But these documents were often incomplete, missing signatures, or dated incorrectly, as if to remind anyone who read them that the truth was never meant to be fully seen. The very act of creating the papers became ritual. Each signature was a prayer, each transfer a hymn, and each ledger a testament to what could be hidden in plain sight. And yet, for all the sophistication, the system relied on human trust. Clerics trusted bankers, bankers trusted lawyers, and lawyers trusted that nobody outside the circle would ask the right questions. Break that trust, and the carefully constructed empire began to tremble. Secrets held for decades could unravel in a single audit, a single whistleblower, a single journalist with the patience to follow the breadcrumbs. But most never did. Most accepted the surface, the veneer of holiness and legitimacy, without probing deeper. That was the power of the island of lost receipts. It was everywhere and nowhere, present in the wealth of the church, yet invisible to all but the few who moved in its inner circles. And for those few, it offered freedom, influence, and the certainty that actions taken in shadow could never be traced back. The world saw donations, charities, and foundations. The insiders saw a cathedral of paper stretching across continents, sacred in appearance, profane in function, a place where sin and sanctity met silently, leaving no trail for anyone brave enough to follow. In the early 1980s, the Vatican promised transparency, a reckoning for the whispers and rumours that had circulated for decades. External auditors were invited to Rome with the hope that their work would illuminate the hidden corridors of the Istituto per le Opere di Religione. There was fanfare, announcements in newspapers, and a sense that finally the church would answer for its finances. But what arrived was not truth, it was a carefully staged performance. Auditors were greeted with polite smiles and guided through rooms filled with ledgers, files, and statements that appeared complete, orderly, and precise. Every document had a footnote, every transfer a justification, every discrepancy explained in terms that sounded plausible, even logical. And yet, the deeper the auditors tried to go, the more walls they encountered. Requests for original documents were met with carefully curated copies. Questions about offshore accounts received explanations that satisfied superficially but revealed nothing of substance. The audit, in reality, was an illusion. Cooperation meant access only to what the church allowed, a version of reality edited to preserve both reputation and secrecy. If a transaction seemed suspicious, it was marked as clerical error or oversight. If a transfer appeared untraceable, it was described as standard procedure. Any finding that might reflect poorly on the Vatican Bank was footnoted, buried, or redirected. The auditors, bound by protocol and diplomacy, often felt as though they were walking a maze where every path led back to the same controlled spaces. They reported their work with precision, noting compliance with available records. Yet the gaps, the omissions, the shadows remained. And so the promised reckoning vanished quietly into bureaucracy, leaving behind the appearance of accountability without the reality of it. Officials in Rome praised the auditor's work, claimed improvements, and highlighted minor corrections as evidence of reform. But anyone looking for the real story, the truth, hidden beneath layers of paper and piety, found only walls and whispers. The audit was less about discovery and more about performance, a ritual demonstrating that the church could be scrutinized, but only to the extent it chose. The effect was clear. Outside observers were placated, journalists had something to report, governments nodded politely, and the inner workings of the Vatican Bank remained untouched. The ledger that balanced power instead of numbers continued to operate in silence, its secrets preserved. Footnotes replaced facts, curated access replaced transparency, and the system that had survived decades of rumour and scandal remained intact. The lesson was unmistakable. Promises of reckoning could be fulfilled without revealing anything, and appearances could be crafted to satisfy the world while maintaining absolute control. The audit that wasn't became a metaphor, a demonstration of how institutions cloaked in holiness could manipulate process, evade accountability, and preserve influence, all while projecting legitimacy. And for those inside, it was proof that secrecy and strategy, piety and performance could coexist in a balance as delicate as it was durable, ensuring that the true power of the Vatican Bank remained, as always, hidden from view. The art of plausible deniability is older than most of the buildings in Rome, and in the Vatican Bank, it became a form of scripture. Executives and clerics learned early that accountability could be managed, statements could be calibrated, and responsibility could be spread thin enough to vanish. Saying we didn't know became a skill, a language spoken in 12 different tongues, each tailored to the culture, the law, and the audience. The phrase was simple, elegant, and effective. In Rome it sounded reverent, In Geneva, it sounded legal. In New York, it sounded procedural. No matter who asked, no matter how pressing the question, the answer carried a subtle truth. The system continued, even while the words reassured the outside world. Compliance reforms arrived like a breeze through the halls of the Vatican, touching papers, meetings, and protocols, creating the appearance of accountability. Policies were written, committees formed, audits scheduled, all to demonstrate that the Church was modern, responsible, and cooperative. And yet beneath the polished floors, beneath the marbled corridors, the old circuitry hummed quietly, a network of trust, discretion, and invisible lines of communication that remained untouched. Money moved, accounts transferred, and secrets preserved without interruption. Those who had managed the system for decades continued their work, their hands guided by habits, experience, and the silent rules that had been passed down through generations. Plausible deniability was not deception alone, it was protection, a buffer between power and consequence, a shield that allowed the Church to operate in ways that might never withstand scrutiny. Letters were drafted with care, meetings recorded selectively, and memoranda written to misdirect while preserving real intent. And yet, it was more than mechanics, it was theology in practice. The belief that truth could be flexible, that responsibility could be divided, and that appearance could be as important as reality. For those outside, the reforms suggested a bank that had changed, an institution learning from mistakes, an organization embracing transparency. For insiders, the lesson was clear: adapt, respond, and continue. Protect the network, preserve the system, and maintain control. The banker's gospel was quiet but powerful. It reminded everyone involved that survival did not require openness, that influence depended on secrecy, and that money could be moved, altered, or hidden without ever leaving a trace of culpability. Every phrase, every report, every gesture reinforced the same principle. The world could be reassured, and yet the engine of the bank could continue as before. The hum beneath the floors was not mechanical, it was human. The experience, the skill, and the discipline of decades of operatives who had learned to balance morality with opportunity, faith with ambition, and visibility with invisibility. And as long as the hum persisted, the Church retained its power, its reach, and its freedom. Plausible deniability was not a weakness. It was a weapon, a strategy, and a doctrine that ensured that the Vatican Bank could endure, even when every external audit, every inquiry, and every scandal suggested otherwise. It was a gospel written not in ink but in action, a story that could be told many ways without ever telling the truth. In the year 2012, the Vatican experienced a flood not of water but of paper, brown envelopes filled with photocopied memos, letters, and internal reports began appearing in the hands of journalists, bloggers, and analysts. Bedrooms, previously private and sacred, were transformed into makeshift archives, stacked with the documents of the Church's financial life. Whistleblowers, once trusted servants, became heretics in the eyes of their peers. The very act of revealing truth was treated as betrayal, a violation of sacred secrecy, a sin against the institution itself. The papers told stories that had long been whispered, accounts that did not match public statements, transfers that suggested favoritism or impropriety, and memos that revealed how the Vatican managed both reputation and influence with precision. The headlines spread quickly. International newspapers splashed stories of corruption, intrigue, and secrecy across front pages, shaking the perception of sanctity that the Church had cultivated for centuries. Damage control became doctrine, a methodical and careful response designed to protect the institution while acknowledging just enough to satisfy curiosity. The Pope called for reforms, commissions were established, and promises of transparency echoed through the streets of Rome. But inside the Vatican, the hum of the old circuitry continued. Funds moved quietly, Ledgers were adjusted, explanations drafted, and operations continued largely unaffected by the public spectacle. The Vatileaks crisis revealed the tension between appearance and reality. On one side, the Church faced a modern world demanding accountability. On the other, centuries of tradition and secrecy resisted intrusion. Each leaked document carried consequences, but also lessons. Those who handled the papers understood that even in a flood, control could be maintained. The whistleblowers had intended exposure, but the system was resilient, capable of absorbing shock while retaining its essential function. Diplomats, journalists, and theologians debated the content, trying to decipher what was scandalous, what was routine, and what was merely the result of bureaucratic complexity. The public, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile faith with evidence, reverence with revelation, devotion with disclosure. Brown envelopes, photocopies, and private archives became symbols of both transparency and vulnerability. Secrets once confined to marble corridors and shadowed offices had found their way into the light. Yet the Church endured. The lessons of centuries had prepared it for such exposure. Scandals could be managed, reforms could be issued, public perception could be guided. And beneath it all, the old systems, built on experience, discretion, and plausible deniability, continued to hum quietly. Vatileaks was not an end. It was a test, a reminder that even the most sacred institutions must navigate the currents of disclosure, that power is always vulnerable, and that paper, once released, has a voice louder than any official statement. And through it all, the Vatican Bank remained a place where money, secrecy, and faith intersected. A cathedral of finance operating beyond the eyes of most, even in the age of leaks and headlines. Peter's Pence has long been presented as a simple act of devotion, a collection of alms sent from the faithful to support the poor and needy. Year after year, envelopes filled with cash or checks arrived at the Vatican, each note a symbol of trust, hope, and faith. But in the 1980s and 90s, the journey of that money took unexpected turns. Rather than reaching soup kitchens, orphanages, or disaster relief funds, a significant portion of these donations found their way into something far less visible. The Istituto per le Opere di Religione, the Vatican Bank, became the channel through which these alms were transformed, not into immediate aid, but into investments that promised prestige, influence, and long-term returns. Palaces in Rome, apartments in Paris, and townhouses in London were acquired, their addresses appearing in documents, not as charity, but as assets. Buildings with ornate facades and elegant interiors became, in a sense, silent beneficiaries of devotion. While parishioners believed their contributions were helping the poor, elsewhere, the money was used to expand the church's real estate portfolio, creating a network of properties that reinforced both wealth and status. Clerics and bankers spoke in quiet tones about acquisitions, investments, and market opportunities. The goal was presented as stewardship, a way to protect and grow the church's resources for future charitable use. But the path from envelope to palace was complex, circuitous, and obscured. Shell companies, trusts, and numbered accounts ensured that the origins of the funds were difficult to trace. Transparency was promised in reports that circulated internally, yet outsiders rarely saw more than summaries and assurances. Whispers began among journalists, auditors, and observers. Questions about Peter's Pence arose. Inquiries into how exactly donations were being used, and whether the faithful were aware that their money had become part of a property empire. Vatican officials responded with explanations that were carefully worded, citing long-term strategy, prudence, and responsible management. The faithful continued to give, unaware that their generosity sometimes funded luxury apartments and prime real estate rather than immediate relief. And yet, the system had its logic. Palaces and apartments could generate income, house visiting dignitaries, and serve as collateral in complex financial arrangements. They were investments meant to protect and enhance the Church's influence in an unpredictable world. Still, the moral tension was palpable. The act of giving, a sacred ritual, collided with financial strategy, creating a narrative where devotion and discretion coexisted uneasily. Peter's pence became more than alms. It was a story of faith transformed, of charity redirected, and of money that carried power in ways that few donors could have imagined. Every envelope, every coin, every note contained not just hope, but also the potential to shape streets, skylines, and the quiet corridors of influence. And in that transformation, the faithful gave more than money. They unknowingly contributed to a palace of power built on the foundation of their trust. In the early 21st century, the world began to demand accountability. Organizations with names like Moneyval, FATF, and other watchdog acronyms emerged, tasked with monitoring financial institutions, enforcing anti-money laundering rules, and ensuring that money moved transparently. The Vatican Bank, long accustomed to operating in shadows, suddenly found itself facing reports, statutes, and recommendations that looked sharp on paper. Officials in Rome welcomed the dialogue with polite compliance, drafting new rules, revising internal procedures, and announcing reforms that promised oversight, transparency, and cooperation. Yet beneath the announcements, the ecosystem remained largely untouched. The systems that had been built over decades to shield transfers, obscure owners, and move money silently continued to hum. The questions that Moneyval reports posed were serious, and yet they often collided with centuries of established practice, sovereign exemptions, and extraterritorial privileges. How do you regulate an institution whose design is to be unobservable, whose accounts are numbered, whose transactions weave through layers of secrecy, trusts, and shell companies? Compliance reforms looked like teeth, but in practice, they often nibbled at the edges. Audits were welcomed with curated access, inquiries met with partial disclosure, and answers carefully crafted to satisfy external observers while leaving the core system intact. Clerics, bankers, and administrators had grown adept at navigating these expectations. They spoke of cooperation, oversight, and governance, but the hum beneath the floors told a different story. Controls could be implemented in appearance without altering the actual flow of funds. Processes could be documented while the real movements continued along old circuits. Oversight became a ritual, a carefully staged interaction where auditors saw what they were allowed to see, regulators were reassured, and the internal network remained invisible. In some ways, the guardians themselves became part of the performance. Reports were published, recommendations made, and praise issued for the steps taken. But the underlying question persisted. Can a system designed to operate in shadow ever be fully monitored? Outside, observers saw progress, checked boxes, and noted new policies. Inside, the bank continued its operations, balancing influence, faith, and finance with precision. It was an ecosystem built on centuries of discretion, experience, and plausible deniability, and no statute or report could fully penetrate it. Yet the existence of Moneyval and similar organizations created pressure, a gentle current reminding those inside that the world was watching. Policies were updated, statements polished, and appearances maintained, a constant negotiation between tradition and scrutiny. For the faithful, the world of watchdogs and statutes seemed distant, technical, and abstract. For insiders, it was a test of skill, patience, and adaptation, proving once again that control, discretion, and legacy could endure even in the face of oversight. Guardians at the gate, real or symbolic, influenced the perception of accountability without dismantling the quiet networks that had sustained the Vatican Bank for decades. The teeth were sharp on paper, but in practice, they rarely bit deep enough to change the flow of money hidden beneath the surface. Inside the Vatican, A cardinal's signature carried weight beyond theology. Scarlet robes and black ink met in the quiet rooms where investment committees convened. These gatherings were not about sermons, prayers, or scripture. They were about patient capital, trust, and influence. The committee members spoke in careful tones, using terms like bonds, equities, and derivatives, but all filtered through the Church's understanding of discretion and prudence. Middlemen, trusted for decades, facilitated transactions that moved vast sums across borders, across currencies, and across layers of secrecy. Every decision was measured, not just in financial terms, but in terms of reputation, power, and long-term consequence. When a cardinal approved an investment, it was more than a signature on a ledger. It was a stamp of legitimacy, a signal that the Church endorsed a strategy, a partner, or a project. And yet, very few dared to question the details. Footnotes were optional. Explanations were limited. The authority of a prince of the Church was sufficient. This created a dual reality. Outside observers saw governance, oversight, and structured financial planning. Inside, the network of capital moved fluidly, benefiting from centuries of discretion and relationships that transcended ordinary financial logic. The cardinal's portfolio was not measured merely in assets, but in influence. Real estate in Rome and across Europe, shares in Swiss banks, stakes in ventures that touched everything from energy to media. Each investment was a node in a vast web connecting the Church to the secular world, silently and efficiently. The process was deliberate. Risk was managed through a combination of legal structures, trusted agents, and experience. Yet, it was also personal. Decisions were guided by intuition, relationships, and a sense of duty to protect the Church's resources. The cardinal knew that every signature carried consequences, but he also knew that the system was built to absorb scrutiny. Approvals were formal, meticulous, and ceremonial, creating records that satisfied auditors while preserving operational freedom. The human element was as critical as the financial one. Clerics, advisors, and middlemen were selected for loyalty, discretion, and understanding of both canon and capital. Mistrust was minimal because the consequences of betrayal were severe and clear. The cardinal's portfolio was a testament to the Church's ability to navigate modern finance without abandoning centuries of tradition. It was a balance of power, prudence, and secrecy, demonstrating that influence could be wielded quietly, methodically, and effectively. Even as markets fluctuated and governments imposed regulations, the structures remained resilient, reinforced by authority, experience, and reputation. The lesson was unmistakable. In the Vatican, a signature was more than approval. It was trust, power, and protection, all wrapped into one. And when a prince of the Church signed, who dared ask for footnotes? The Vatican is a country smaller than most cities, yet its influence in global finance has often rivaled that of the largest nations. Diplomatic pouches moved through airports and embassies quietly, immune to the scrutiny that would trap any ordinary transaction. Papers, cash, and documents passed hands in ways that relied on tradition as much as law. Sovereign immunity provided a shield, a barrier that few dared challenge. Governments, banks, and multinational corporations approached Rome with care, aware that a single call from a friendly state could open doors, expedite processes, or even resolve disputes before they appeared. The courtesy extended to the Vatican was not mere politeness. It was a recognition of the Church's unique position, both spiritually and financially. In boardrooms from New York to Zurich, executives considered the Vatican a player whose weight could tilt markets, sway negotiations, and redirect capital. The global money grid bent subtly, almost imperceptibly, to accommodate the interests of the smallest country on earth. Exchanges that would be delayed for ordinary institutions were expedited. Accounts that might trigger alarms in regulatory systems were moved with minimal inquiry. and the actors behind these transactions often never spoke of them, relying on whispers and coded language to maintain discretion. It was a system built on trust, tradition, and mutual understanding, reinforced by centuries of precedent. Yet there was also strategy. The Vatican knew the power of its position and the leverage granted by sovereign status. Every call, every meeting, every diplomatic gesture was carefully orchestrated. Allies were cultivated, partnerships maintained, and relationships leveraged to achieve both spiritual and financial goals. And while the outside world often focused on ceremonial aspects, the Pope's speeches, the blessing of new leaders, the signing of treaties, the financial machinery operated quietly, efficiently, and often invisibly. Those who interacted with it understood the unspoken rules. Questions were framed carefully, requests were precise, and responses were measured. The courtesy of princes, in this context, was more than etiquette. It was an essential part of a system that allowed the Vatican to navigate the global economy with agility and authority disproportionate to its size. Even in crises, these networks provided resilience. Access to foreign accounts, real estate deals, and investments could be maintained through channels that ordinary institutions would envy. The Vatican's ability to call upon states, banks, and allies and receive cooperation in return demonstrated the unique intersection of power, faith, and finance. And, for the faithful, it was nearly invisible, a backdrop to the rituals of daily life. For the bankers, clerics, and operatives involved, it was a lesson in leverage, diplomacy, and subtlety. The smallest country on earth commanded influence far beyond its borders, and every diplomatic pouch, every phone call, and every courteous gesture was a reminder that in the world of finance, size alone does not dictate power. Late at night, the lights of the Vatican Bank glowed faintly behind shuttered windows. Clerks and auditors moved quietly through empty corridors, reviewing accounts that had sat dormant for years, numbers that seemed to appear and vanish with little explanation. Donors with unfamiliar names, charities that existed only on paper, and transfers that defied ordinary accounting logic filled the ledgers. The process was meticulous, deliberate, and often strange. Bankers found themselves in a confessional of sorts, not seeking absolution for sins of the soul, but for the anomalies of finance. Each account had to be examined, reconciled, and justified. What was the source of the funds? Who approved the transactions? Could a charitable purpose truly be verified, or was it a veil for something else entirely? Every question required documentation, often layers of approvals, signatures, and internal memos. Even forgiveness now carried a procedural element. KYC forms, Know Your Customer regulations, once foreign to the Vatican, became part of the ritual. Clerics and accountants alike signed statements attesting that inquiries had been made, that identities were verified, and that due diligence had been observed. The penitent accounts were more than bookkeeping. They were a reflection of the tension between centuries of secrecy and the modern demand for transparency. Dormant numbers revealed patterns, some routine, others alarming. Transfers that had once been unquestioned now drew scrutiny. The bank had to reconcile faith with finance, discretion with disclosure. Some accounts held clues to long-forgotten deals, investments in real estate, art, or overseas ventures that had never been public. Others hinted at donors whose generosity had been redirected, intentionally or otherwise, for purposes beyond immediate charity. Each ledger told a story. Each number was a question waiting for an answer. And as the night deepened, the quiet hum of computers and the scratch of pens became a rhythm, a slow process of confession and reconciliation. Bankers became both priests and parishioners, admitting errors, verifying facts, and documenting intentions. The wave of late-night closures was a ritual, a modern act of contrition. The Church acknowledged that past practices could no longer remain unseen. It was an era in which oversight, accountability, and compliance demanded attention. The penitent accounts were the embodiment of that shift. They revealed how much had been done in silence and how much now required light. Clerks, auditors, and clerics worked side by side, aware that each correction, each verification, was part of a larger story. A story in which the Vatican had to reconcile its past with the present, ensuring that the sacred act of giving, the faith of donors, and the integrity of financial practice could coexist. By dawn, many accounts were closed, reconciled, or flagged for further inquiry. The confessional emptied, but the lessons lingered. Forgiveness had a new language, and numbers now bore witness to both devotion and diligence. The penitent accounts had spoken, quietly, methodically, and insistently, reminding everyone that even the most secretive ledgers must eventually face the light. For the first time in decades, the doors of justice creaked open to a world long kept at arm's length. Courtrooms were filled with judges in black robes, witnesses taking oaths, and stacks of evidence that had been hidden beneath layers of paperwork, secrecy, and silence. The trial moved slowly, deliberately, as attorneys presented documents, questioned clerics, and traced the paths of money through the Vatican's labyrinthine networks. Each day brought new revelations, names whispered in corridors now spoken aloud, transactions once invisible now laid bare under the bright lights of scrutiny. The faithful, watching from outside or listening through media reports, began to understand a different liturgy, one of subpoenas, cross-examinations, and legal procedure. The language was unfamiliar, yet the stakes felt immediate. Money that had once been abstract, almost mystical, became human. The intentions, mistakes, and choices behind each transfer revealed themselves as tangible, accountable actions. Witnesses spoke of meetings in austere offices, late-night phone calls, and confidential memos that had dictated the movement of millions. Clerics described decisions made in confidence, choices that now faced examination under the eyes of law. Judges, impartial and procedural, guided the narrative, ensuring that evidence was heard and testimony recorded. Observers noted the tension between faith and accountability. Religious authority had long held sway, commanding obedience, respect, and deference. Now that authority met a new rhythm, a cadence defined not by rituals or prayers, but by statutes, precedents, and legal reasoning. Every document presented became a mirror, reflecting decades of governance, discretion, and influence. Transactions were not just financial, they were moral, ethical, and symbolic. The trial illuminated the cost of secrecy, showing how opacity had allowed both stewardship and impropriety to coexist. It also demonstrated the courage required to face such scrutiny, as witnesses navigated between loyalty to the Church and duty to the law. Questions were asked that had never been considered before. How had oversight failed? Where had responsibility been deferred? Which structures allowed discretion to turn into concealment? Each answer revealed both the complexity of the Vatican's financial world and the resilience of its traditions. Yet the trial also revealed something deeper. Transparency was not just about exposing wrongdoing. It was about educating the faithful, about showing that even sacred institutions could be held accountable, that money, like faith, had consequences. The liturgy of litigation unfolded slowly, with solemnity, ritual, and drama. Every argument, objection, and clarification became part of a narrative where law and devotion intersected. And as the days turned into weeks, the world began to see the price of secrecy, the value of oversight, and the weight of responsibility. In the end, the trial that touched the altar was more than a legal proceeding. It was a lesson, a revelation, and a turning point. It showed that even the most revered institutions are not beyond scrutiny, and that faith and accountability, when balanced, can illuminate truths long hidden in shadow. After the public scrutiny of trials and audits, the Vatican Bank introduced a wave of reforms. New boards were installed, statutes rewritten, and promises made to ensure transparency, accountability, and compliance with international standards. Statements circulated, press releases highlighted procedural changes, and observers were invited to witness the transformation. On paper, everything appeared orderly, deliberate, and progressive. Yet, within the marble halls and quiet offices, whispers of old habits lingered. Clerics and administrators who had worked under decades of discretion continued to move with practiced subtlety. The language of reform became ceremonial, a ritual as familiar as any liturgy. Meetings were held to discuss governance, compliance, and oversight. Policies were drafted, committees convened, and reports compiled. External auditors and regulators were given curated access to documents, files, and data, illustrating a willingness to cooperate and comply. The faithful were reassured, the press reported improvement, and confidence appeared to return. But behind the polished statements, the structures that had enabled discreet transfers, numbered accounts, and anonymous donations remained largely intact. Practices learned over decades were not abandoned overnight. Procedures adapted, but the core mechanisms, networks of influence, trusted intermediaries, and sovereign privileges remained operational. Observers asked whether these changes represented genuine conversion or a refined form of camouflage. Could the bank truly shed centuries of secrecy, or was it simply cloaking old methods in a new language of governance? The rhythm of daily operations continued as before, guided by experience, discretion, and a deep understanding of both canon and finance. Decisions were made with the same care, balancing moral, financial, and institutional considerations. New statutes outlined roles, responsibilities, and reporting requirements, but the interpretation of these rules often relied on internal judgment, historical precedent, and subtle negotiation. The duality of appearance versus practice became the defining feature of this period. To the outside world, reforms signaled accountability. To insiders, they provided continuity, a way to meet expectations without disrupting the systems that had long sustained the bank's operations. Questions about enforcement, oversight, and real change persisted. Were auditors truly seeing the full picture, or only a curated view designed to satisfy regulations and reassure observers? Were new boards empowered to act independently, or were they guided by the enduring influence of long-standing administrators? Every meeting, every report, every policy became a test of sincerity, interpretation, and execution. The walls of the bank carried echoes of the past, lessons learned, and habits ingrained. For those watching from the outside, reforms promised a new era of transparency. For those within, they were both a challenge and an opportunity to demonstrate adaptability, prudence, and resilience. And so, the question lingered. Were these reforms a true conversion of a historic institution, or a sophisticated ritual of repetition, ensuring that old power could continue under the guise of change? Only time would reveal the answer, as the bank navigated the tension between tradition, scrutiny, and the demands of a modern world that no longer accepted secrecy without question. Behind the headlines and press releases, the cost of silence became painfully real. Missions in Africa, Asia, and Latin America waited for funds that never arrived. Hospitals remained half-built, clinics went unstaffed, and programs meant to feed, heal, and educate were delayed indefinitely. Each unfulfilled promise represented lives affected, communities left in uncertainty, and the slow erosion of trust. The scandal surrounding the Vatican Bank was not abstract. It was measured in empty beds, untended crops, and children who went to sleep hungry. Donors who believed their alms would reach the needy learned that intentions alone could not guarantee action. Money meant for mercy had been diverted, delayed, or obscured, often hidden in the tangle of accounts, shell corporations, and obscure transfers. For those waiting on the other end, the bureaucracy became a wall, impenetrable and indifferent. Bankers spoke in ledgers, auditors in footnotes, and clerics in reassurances. But these voices did not build hospitals, deliver medicine, or feed the hungry. The silence was loud. Every unexplained delay, every missing transaction, every anonymized account contributed to the same outcome, the absence of help where it was needed most. Communities learned to adapt, improvising, rationing, and surviving with whatever resources they could find. The Church's reputation suffered in ways that could not be quantified in currency alone. Faithful supporters questioned whether their contributions mattered, whether oversight existed, and whether institutional secrecy could coexist with moral responsibility. Across continents, whispers circulated among clergy, aid workers, and citizens alike. How much of what had been promised had actually reached the intended recipients? What had been lost to inefficiency, mismanagement, or misappropriation? The answers were complex, often incomplete, and frustratingly slow to emerge. Yet the human cost was immediate. Children missed vaccinations, water projects remained unfinished, and educational initiatives were shelved. The ripple effect touched every facet of daily life in communities, relying on aid, demonstrating that financial misconduct was not contained to the pages of ledgers or the walls of auditoriums. Each misallocated euro represented more than money. It represented opportunity lost, potential diminished, and hope deferred. The scandal was not simply about numbers, regulations, or reputation. It was about people whose lives intersected with the Church, not through ritual alone, but through reliance on its resources, its promises, and its capacity for care. In the quiet moments, when volunteers and aid workers counted supplies or recorded absences, the subtraction became clear. Each delay, each diversion, each act of concealment was a tangible subtraction from hope. And even as reforms were announced, audits conducted, and board meetings held, the memories of unfulfilled promises remained. Scandal, in this sense, is not ephemeral. It is measured in outcomes, in what could have been, in what should have been. The cost of silence is more than reputational. It is human, visible, and enduring. And as the Church continues to reconcile with its past, the lessons of those gaps remain stark reminders that secrecy, however justified, carries a price that reaches far beyond the walls of banks and offices. The Vatican Bank had endured decades of scrutiny, scandal, and shadowed accounts, yet the final reckoning was not merely about numbers. It was about choices, accountability, and the courage to confront truths long buried. The ledgers were open, files reviewed, and auditors summoned, but the most important entries could not be tallied in euros or dollars. They were written in actions, intentions, and the weight of moral responsibility. Clerics, bankers, and administrators stood at a crossroads, facing a ledger far larger than any accounting book. One side promised the comfort of secrecy, the preservation of power, and the safety of tradition. The other offered transparency, the exposure of error, and the hope of restored trust. Every decision carried a consequence that extended beyond offices, boardrooms, and corridors. The faithful, who contributed with generosity, waited silently for accountability, for the knowledge that their alms were transforming lives rather than being lost in opaque channels. Auditors traced transfers across continents, following the flow of funds meant for the poor, hospitals, schools, and missions, some of which had never received the support promised. Each trace revealed not only mismanagement, but also opportunity deferred, lives affected, and faith challenged. The ledger of light demanded more than procedural compliance. It required an embrace of honesty so complete that it might unsettle long-held authority. Decisions made in silence, once invisible, were now visible, and each cleric faced a question. Would fidelity to tradition outweigh the call to accountability? or could both coexist without compromise? External observers watched, journalists reported, and scholars analysed every move, but the ultimate measure was internal. It was a moral accounting, a reflection on how power had been wielded, how money had moved, and whether the institution could reconcile its sacred mission with its worldly actions. Transparency did not merely protect the faithful, it preserved the integrity of the church itself. And yet, secrecy was seductive. It promised control, stability, and the avoidance of discomfort. But every act of concealment left an echo in the lives of those depending on the church, a subtle subtraction from hope, faith, and trust. The ledger of light required recognition that financial stewardship and spiritual guidance were inseparable. A misplaced euro could undermine a mission, a delayed transfer could cost lives, and opaque practices could erode faith faster than scandal alone. By confronting errors openly, acknowledging past failures, and committing to clarity, the Church had the chance to transform. The balance sheet was not printed on paper. It was written in souls, in the trust restored, in the aid delivered, in communities rebuilt, and in the courage to confront unholy truths with honesty. Decisions made now would echo for generations, defining not the size of accounts, but the scope of conscience. The ledger of light was final. It offered no hiding, no creative accounting, and no facile absolution. Only choice remained: to embrace transparency and allow faith to heal, or to cling to secrecy and watch trust fade. In the quiet of the Vatican offices, the weight of that choice settled, measured not in sums, but in the lives touched, the hope preserved, and the legacy left. It was the only balance sheet that mattered,